The large mansion was quiet, except for the faint sound of a clock ticking away the time in the corner of the room. The CEO, a man used to power, control, and a life of luxury, had always lived surrounded by wealth. His life was one many dreamed of, with expensive cars, a private jet, and a mansion filled with things that money could buy. However, there was something missing from this perfect picture, a sense of genuine connection. He didn't have many close relationships. His world was often a place of transactions, deals, and calculations, where emotions rarely played a part. The people around him, whether colleagues or friends, were there because of his wealth, his position, or the influence he held. But there was one person who seemed to be different from the rest. She had been hired as his maid a few months ago, a quiet young woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile. She didn't stand out in a room full of people, but there was something about her that intrigued him. She was always polite, always on time, and always respectful, but she didn't seem to connect with him or anyone for that matter. It was as if she kept to herself, never sharing much about her personal life, never asking questions, and rarely even making eye contact. To the CEO, this was odd. He had hired staff before, but never anyone quite like her. She seemed so shy, so reserved, and he couldn't understand why. He wondered if she was simply a quiet person, or if something deeper lay beneath the surface. One evening, after another long day of meetings and negotiations, the CEO found himself lying on the couch in his living room trying to unwind. He had a glass of wine in hand, but his mind wasn't on the drink, it was on his maid. He had been thinking about her for weeks now, wondering about her silence, her careful distance from him and everyone else. He thought back to the time when she had first started working in his home. She had been polite, almost painfully so, but it was clear she wasn't interested in conversation. The few times he had tried to engage her, she had answered in short, polite sentences, never offering more than was necessary. It was as though she preferred to remain invisible. As the evening grew later, the CEO's curiosity about her grew as well. There was a quiet stillness in the house now, and the only sound was the soft footsteps of his maid as she went about her duties. He had seen her cleaning the house before, but tonight, he had a different idea in mind. He wanted to learn more about her, to understand why she was so distant. But instead of asking her directly, he decided to test her. His plan was simple. He would pretend to fall asleep on the couch, and then observe her actions when she thought he was unaware. Perhaps he would be able to uncover something about her behavior, something that she might hide when she knew he was watching. With that thought in mind, the CEO closed his eyes, relaxed his muscles, and let his body fall into the relaxed, almost lifeless position of sleep. He made sure to breathe steadily, to appear as though he were truly asleep. He knew it was a small test, but one that he believed would reveal something about her. Time seemed to slow down as he lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. The soft rustling of her footsteps as she moved around the room, the sound of a cleaning cloth wiping across the furniture. These were the things that filled the silence. He kept his breathing steady, trying not to give away the fact that he was awake. The maid, as usual, was very quiet as she worked. The CEO found it curious how she seemed to glide through the house, never disturbing the peace or making a sound that could break the calm atmosphere of the evening. She was a professional, no doubt about that, but there was something about her presence that made him feel uneasy, something he couldn't quite place. His curiosity grew as he heard her approach. Her soft steps came closer, and for a brief moment he could hear her stop right near the couch. He wondered what she would do next. Would she act as she always did, maintaining her composure, keeping her distance? Or would she reveal something else when she thought he wasn't watching? The room was dimly lit, and the only source of light came from the soft glow of the lamps near the windows. The maid's figure was shadowed in the dim light, her movements slow and deliberate. For a moment she simply stood there, facing away from him. The CEO could hear her breathe softly, but she didn't make a move for what seemed like an eternity. It was as if she was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. He felt a strange tension in the air, and he wondered what was going through her mind at that moment. Then, without warning, she turned and moved to the far side of the room, picking up a cleaning cloth. He had been expecting her to continue her work as usual, but what happened next was unexpected. She paused for just a moment longer, glancing back toward the couch where he lay, pretending to sleep. Then she began to do something that left the CEO both surprised and perplexed. She took a deep breath, almost as if she was gathering courage, and began to hum softly. The sound was barely audible, but it was there, sweet, melodic, and calming. It was a song, though the CEO didn't recognize it. It wasn't a tune that he had ever heard her sing before, and it seemed out of place in the otherwise silent house. He had never imagined that the maid would be capable of such an action. Her soft, quiet voice contrasted sharply with the stern and formal image he had built of her. For a moment, he forgot that he was supposed to be observing her. He was lost in the gentle hum of her voice, a side of her he had never seen before. The CEO felt a strange feeling well up inside him, a mix of admiration and curiosity. He had underestimated her. All this time he had thought of her as distant, almost emotionless, but now he realized that she might be more complex than he had imagined. As the sound of her humming filled the room, he began to question his assumptions. Was she truly as shy as she seemed, or was there something more to her that she was hiding? He didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. This small moment of insight had changed everything. His quiet maid, the one he had thought was just another part of the furniture, had shown him a glimpse of something deeper. And in that moment, the CEO realized that his curiosity had only just begun. The CEO had never been one to believe in things like fate or destiny, but after that evening he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. His mind kept returning to the humming sound he had heard, the soft melody that seemed to echo in the quiet of the room long after the maid had finished her cleaning. He was surprised by how much it had affected him. For days after, he couldn't stop thinking about it. It was strange. He had always seen himself as a man of logic, one who relied on facts and analysis to make his decisions. Emotions were for others, he thought. Yet, in those few moments when he had been lying there pretending to sleep, he had felt something stir within him that he couldn't explain. The maid, who had once seemed like an invisible presence in the house, had suddenly become real to him. A person with her own feelings, dreams, and maybe even secrets. His curiosity about her deepened. He wanted to know more. He needed to understand why she had kept to herself all this time. Why she had always maintained such a quiet and distant presence. Was she just shy? Or was there something more behind her silence? The CEO realized that he was now actively watching her, studying her every move, trying to catch glimpses of the person behind the reserved exterior. The next few days were filled with the usual chaos of his business life, calls, meetings, and paperwork. But in the midst of it all, his mind kept wandering back to her. At first, he tried to pretend that he was simply curious, that his interest in the maid was no different than his interest in any of the other staff he employed. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. There was something different about her, and he found himself drawn to that difference in ways he couldn't explain. One evening, after a particularly long day of negotiations, the CEO found himself alone in his office. Staring out the window at the city lights below, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps coming from the hallway, followed by the soft rattle of keys as the maid moved about, likely cleaning the house as usual. He should have been focused on the numbers in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and walked out into the hallway. He knew she was somewhere nearby. He could hear her, but she hadn't yet noticed him. This time he wasn't planning to pretend to be asleep. This time he was going to speak to her. He found her in the living room, dusting off the shelves. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway at first, so he took a step closer. He had always admired how quietly she worked, how efficient and graceful she was. But tonight there was something else, something that he could sense in the air. When she finally turned to face him, she was startled, as though she hadn't expected him to be there. She quickly straightened up, her hands trembling slightly as she set the dusting cloth down. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there in awkward silence, unsure of what to do. The CEO felt a sudden wave of guilt wash over him. He had been studying her without her knowing, observing her from a distance, and now he realized how uncomfortable it must have made her feel. He had never intended to make her feel like an object under his scrutiny. He had simply wanted to understand her better. He cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. She nodded quickly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's okay, sir," she said in a quiet voice. She always referred to him with respect, but tonight, her tone was more distant than usual. The CEO felt a strange desire to make her feel more at ease, to reassure her that he wasn't just a boss but someone who, for once, wanted to connect with another person. He thought for a moment about what he could say to break the silence. "How's your day been?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up at him briefly, her eyes quickly flicking away. "It's been fine, sir." He nodded, unsure of what to say next. He had never been good at small talk, especially with someone as reserved as her. He had always preferred to keep things professional, to maintain a distance between himself and those who worked for him. But tonight it felt different. There was something about her that made him want to try harder, to push past the walls she had built around herself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The CEO could see the maid's nervousness, the way she fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, the way she avoided meeting his eyes. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, he didn't want to back away from the chance to learn more about her. He had already seen a glimpse of something beneath the surface, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Finally, he decided to try a different approach. He wasn't going to ask about her day or try to make small talk. Instead, he would simply be direct. "I've noticed that you're always very quiet," he said, his voice steady. "You keep to yourself a lot. I'm just wondering, why is that?" She stiffened at his words, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. For a brief moment he thought she might leave the room, but then she took a deep breath and spoke. I don't mean to be distant, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just easier for me this way." The CEO could sense the vulnerability in her words, the hesitation in her tone. There was more to it, he was sure of it. He felt a sudden urge to reach out to her, to tell her that she didn't have to explain herself, but at the same time, he knew that he needed to give her space. "Do you ever feel like talking to anyone?" he asked gently. Her eyes met his for the briefest of moments before she quickly looked away. "Not really," she said. "I'm just not good at it." There was a silence between them, one that stretched on longer than either of them anticipated. The CEO didn't know what to say next. He had never been good at dealing with emotions or personal struggles. But in that moment, he felt something stirring inside him, a need to help, to break through the walls she had built. "I think you're stronger than you realize," he said quietly, unsure of why he was even saying it. "And you don't have to keep everything inside." The maid's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her cleaning, her movements stiff and mechanical now. The CEO stood there for a moment, watching her. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. He had just learned something important about her. The days following their conversation in the living room were filled with an uneasy quiet. The CEO found himself thinking about their brief interaction more often than he liked to admit. He had learned something about the maid, something she had never said outright but had revealed through her words and actions. She was closed off, yes, but there was a reason for it, one that she wasn't ready to share. It made him wonder about her past, about the things she had gone through that made her build such a wall around herself. He knew he couldn't force her to open up, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that she was someone who deserved to be understood, someone whose story deserved to be heard. The thought nagged at him, and he found himself wanting to find out more, though he still wasn't sure how to approach her without making her uncomfortable. The CEO tried to focus on his work, but it was difficult. Every time he entered a room, his eyes would instinctively search for her, and when he didn't see her, he felt a strange sense of disappointment. It was an emotion he wasn't used to, especially when it came to someone who worked for him. He had always kept a professional distance from his staff, never allowing personal feelings to interfere with his business. But with the maid, things felt different. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, the CEO found himself alone again in the grand dining room, a glass of wine in hand. The mansion felt unusually quiet without the usual hum of activity. The maid had finished her duties for the night, and he found himself with nothing to do but reflect. As he sat there sipping his wine and staring into the distance, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward her, a curiosity that seemed to grow with each passing day. It was then that he decided to act on the impulse that had been building inside him. He had to know more about her. He couldn't just let things be anymore. But he knew that he couldn't do it in a way that would push her away. He had to approach her carefully without making her feel as though he was prying into her life. The next day, he made an unusual decision. He called her into his office, a place she rarely entered. The CEO had always maintained a strict line between his personal and professional life, but today, he was willing to cross that boundary. He wanted to have a conversation with her, not about work, but about her. When she entered the office, she seemed surprised to see him there. She had always been used to him being in the living room or his study, not his office. She stepped in quietly, her head slightly lowered, her eyes once again avoiding his. She was always so careful not to draw attention to herself, and the CEO couldn't help but feel for her. "I hope I didn't startle you," he said, trying to break the silence that had already settled between them. "Please take a seat." She nodded silently and sat down across from him. There was a slight hesitation in her movements, as though she wasn't sure whether she was supposed to sit or stand, speak or remain silent. The CEO could see how uneasy she was, and it made him feel guilty for having put her in this position. He had never meant to make her feel like an outsider, but now he was unsure how to ease the tension. He took a deep breath and decided to start small. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said the other night. You mentioned that it was easier to keep to yourself." She didn't respond immediately, but he could see her flinch slightly at the mention of their previous conversation. She was clearly uncomfortable with him bringing it up again, but he pressed on gently. "I just want to understand," he continued. "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, but I'd like to know more. I want to know what makes you the person you are. You don't have to be alone with your thoughts." She seemed to struggle with the words, her eyes darting between the floor and his face. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He could see the weight of her hesitation, the reluctance to share something so personal. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that I want to be alone. It's just that it's easier this way." The CEO leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "Easier how?" he asked, genuinely curious. She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her thoughts were too much to carry. "It's easier not to get hurt," she said simply, her voice tinged with sadness. The word struck the CEO like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected her to say something like that. It was clear now that there was more to her than he had realized, that her silence wasn't just about shyness, it was about protecting herself. "Easier not to get hurt," he repeated quietly, his mind racing with thoughts. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that she didn't have to be afraid of him, but he didn't know how to express it in a way that wouldn't seem insincere. For a long moment, the room was quiet. The CEO didn't know what to say. He had always been good at making deals, at solving problems, but this was different. This wasn't something that could be fixed with money or influence. "I don't want you to feel like you have to protect yourself all the time," he said softly, breaking the silence. "You don't have to be afraid here. I'm not going to hurt you." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for any sign of truth in his words. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "It's not you," she said quietly. "It's just that people always disappoint me. It's easier to keep things to myself than to risk being hurt again." The CEO felt a pang of sympathy for her. He realized then that her silence, her distance, wasn't just about being shy. It was about being hurt in the past. She had built a wall around herself to keep the pain out, to avoid the heartache that had come from trusting others. "I understand," he said gently, "but you don't have to face things alone. I can't promise that people won't disappoint you, but I can promise that you don't have to carry that burden by yourself." For the first time since their conversation began, the maid looked at him directly. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of emotions, surprise, confusion, maybe even a hint of hope. She didn't speak, but for the first time the CEO saw a crack in the wall she had built around herself. "Thank you," she said softly, almost as if the words were foreign to her. I didn't know anyone cared." The CEO smiled gently, realizing that this was the first time they had truly connected, the first time she had let him see the person she really was beneath the surface. And in that moment, he knew that this was just the beginning of something more, something that neither of them had anticipated. The days after their conversation in the CEO's office passed in a blur. There was a change in the air between them, something unspoken but very real. The maid, who had always kept to herself, was still quiet, but now there was a softness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. The CEO couldn't help but notice it. Her shoulders were less tense, her movements more fluid. as though she had let go of some of the weight she had been carrying. Though they hadn't spoken much since that day, there was a new understanding between them. The CEO didn't push her to talk more, and she didn't retreat into herself as much. There was an unspoken agreement now that they would simply exist in the same space without the pressure of expectations or uncomfortable silence. But even though there was a quiet peace between them, the CEO couldn't shake the feeling that he was only seeing the tip of the iceberg when it came to her life. There were still so many things he didn't understand, things that she was still keeping hidden, things she wasn't ready to share. And yet every time he looked at her, he couldn't help but feel a growing desire to learn more. He wanted to know what made her the person she was, why she had closed herself off from the world. One evening after dinner, the CEO decided to take a walk around the grounds of the mansion. He had always enjoyed the solitude of his large property, the way the night air felt cool against his skin. It was one of the few times he felt like he could think clearly, without the distractions of business or the constant hum of his day-to-day life. As he walked along the garden path, he found himself lost in thought, his mind drifting back to the maid. He knew that he had to respect her boundaries, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that he wanted to help her, if only she would let him. He had never been one to offer help unless it was necessary, but with her it felt different. It wasn't about charity or obligation. It was about genuinely wanting to see her happy, to see her free from the fear that seemed to govern her life. The CEO stopped near a fountain in the garden, watching the water dance in the moonlight. He had always been drawn to the beauty of the place, its quiet elegance, the way it seemed to mirror the peace he craved. But tonight it didn't bring him the usual calm. Instead, it reminded him of the inner turmoil he felt whenever he thought about her. Just as he was about to turn and head back inside, he heard the faintest sound behind him, a soft rustling of footsteps on the gravel. He turned to see the maid, who was standing a few paces away, looking at him with a hesitant expression. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't mean to intrude." The CEO smiled softly, feeling a wave of warmth toward her. "You're not intruding," he said gently. "I was just thinking." She nodded, her eyes flicking nervously to the ground. There was something in her gaze that made him pause. She wasn't looking at him in the same way she had before, the same way she had looked at everyone. This time there was a vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet longing that tugged at his heart. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. He hadn't meant to sound so concerned, but the words came out before he could stop them. She hesitated before speaking, as though weighing her words carefully. "I'm fine," she said, but there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice. The CEO studied her for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He could tell she wasn't being entirely truthful. There was something more she wanted to say, something she was holding back. He wanted to ask her directly, to push for more, but he knew better than to force her into a conversation she wasn't ready for. Instead, he took a small step closer, his voice calm and reassuring. "You don't have to keep everything to yourself, you know. I'm here if you ever want to talk." The maid looked up at him, her eyes wide. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The soft sounds of the garden filled the silence, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind. The CEO could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, and for the first time, he realized just how much he had come to care about her. "I don't know how to talk about it," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I've never really shared anything with anyone before." The CEO's heart ached as he listened to her words. He could see that the walls she had built around herself were high and thick, reinforced by years of fear and doubt. She had spent so long hiding her true self that it had become second nature to her. "You don't have to tell me everything at once," he said gently. "But if you ever feel like sharing, I'm here, and you don't have to be afraid of what I'll think." Her gaze softened at his words, and for the briefest of moments, she seemed to consider his offer. But then, just as quickly, the walls around her heart snapped back into place. She looked away, her expression hardening once again. "I should go," she said quietly, turning to walk away. The CEO watched her leave, his heart heavy. He had hoped that their brief conversation might have opened a door, that she might have felt just a little bit more comfortable with him. But it seemed that she wasn't ready. Still, he couldn't give up on her. He knew that it would take time. that she couldn't be forced into sharing things she wasn't ready to share. But he also knew that she deserved better than this life of isolation. She deserved to feel safe, to feel like she could trust others, and perhaps in time she might come to trust him. The next few days passed quietly, with the maid continuing her work as usual. She didn't approach him again, but there was a subtle shift in her behavior. She seemed to be a little more at ease around him, a little less guarded. It was as though she had finally begun to accept that he wasn't just another person who would disappoint her, that maybe, just maybe, he could be someone she could rely on. One evening, as the CEO sat in his study, working late into the night, he heard the faintest knock on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he thought he had imagined the sound. But then it came again, more distinct this time. He stood up, walked over to the door and opened it. To his surprise, the maid was standing there, her eyes wide and hesitant. She looked as though she had been standing there for a while, unsure of whether she should knock or leave. "Can I help you?" the CEO asked, his voice soft, knowing that this was a moment that could change everything. I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice shaky but sincere, "for not pushing me, for being patient." The CEO smiled warmly, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "I'm just glad you feel like you can talk to me, even if it's just a little." The maid nodded slowly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. For the first time, she seemed to be more than just the quiet, reserved woman who cleaned his house. She was someone with depth, someone who had a story to tell, if only she could find the courage to share it. The days after the maid's quiet thank you in the CEO's study felt different, as if something had shifted between them. The change wasn't drastic, but it was noticeable. It was as though the walls that had surrounded her were starting to crack, piece by piece, and in their place, there was a tentative connection that neither of them had expected. The CEO, who had always been in control of every aspect of his life, found himself thinking about her more often than he wanted to admit. He had spent his whole life surrounded by power and business dealings, never allowing anyone to get too close. But now with the maid, everything felt uncertain. There were moments when he didn't know how to act around her. Moments when the silence between them felt heavy and filled with things left unsaid. Still, there was an undeniable pull, an undeniable desire to know more, to help her find the courage to open up. As the days turned into weeks, the maid continued to do her work with the same quiet professionalism she always had. But now, there was something different about the way she moved through the house. She wasn't as stiff, as guarded. The CEO noticed that she smiled more often, even if it was just a small curve of her lips. She was still reserved, but there was an openness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. One evening, as the CEO was finishing up a long day of work, he found himself walking down the hallway toward the living room. He hadn't seen her for a while, and he wondered where she was. As he passed the doorway to the kitchen, he noticed that the lights were still on and a soft humming reached his ears. It was a sound he recognized immediately, the same soft melody she had hummed weeks ago. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should interrupt her or just let her have this quiet time to herself. But something inside him urged him to step forward to make this moment count. He knocked gently on the doorframe before stepping into the kitchen. She was standing at the counter, wiping down the surfaces, her back to him. She didn't seem to hear him at first, lost in her thoughts. But when she turned and saw him, she quickly straightened up, her expression shifting to one of surprise. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice softer than usual. I heard you singing." For a moment there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but then she smiled faintly, as though she wasn't entirely embarrassed. "It's nothing," she said quietly, lowering her gaze. "Just something I do sometimes." The CEO stepped into the room fully, taking a seat at the small table by the window. "I think it's beautiful," he said, watching her closely. "It's rare to hear someone sing like that. Why don't you sing more often?" She looked down, her fingers tightening around the cloth she was holding. "I'm not really good at it," she said, her voice small. "And it's just for me. I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." The CEO shook his head, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "You don't make anyone uncomfortable. I think the opposite, actually. It's nice to hear someone express themselves like that." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a brief moment they held each other's gaze. There was something in her eyes that made the CEO feel both heartbroken and hopeful at the same time. She was so closed off, so afraid of letting anyone see the parts of her that she kept hidden. But here in the quiet of the kitchen, he saw a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. "You don't have to hide," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "Not from me." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "It's hard," she whispered. "It's hard to let anyone in. I've been alone for so long, it feels safer this way." The CEO's heart ached as he listened to her words. He could see the fear that still clung to her, the fear that had driven her to isolate herself from the world. It was a fear he could understand, even if he hadn't experienced it in the same way. He knew what it was like to guard your heart, to keep others at a distance, to protect yourself from the hurt that came with trusting too easily. "I know it's hard," he said quietly, his voice full of empathy, "but you don't have to face it alone. Not anymore." She didn't respond immediately, but her gaze softened and the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease, if only for a moment. The CEO could see that she was struggling with the idea of opening up to him, and he knew that it would take time for her to trust him completely. But he was willing to wait. He was willing to be patient, to let her find her own pace. "I don't know how to change," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to stop being afraid." "You don't have to change all at once," he said gently. "You just have to take small steps, and you don't have to do it alone. I'll be here, every step of the way." For the first time in a long while, she seemed to believe him. There was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a tiny spark that hadn't been there before, and that was enough for the CEO. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to happen overnight. But he also knew that they had both come a long way since that first night when he had pretended to sleep, watching her from a distance. The next few weeks were filled with quiet progress. The maid began to trust him more, allowing herself to be a little more vulnerable little by little. She still had moments of hesitation, moments when her walls came back up, but she was slowly starting to let go of the fear that had held her captive for so long. The CEO, for his part, continued to be patient, offering her space when she needed it, but also being there when she wanted to talk. He never pushed her, never made her feel like she had to open up before she was ready. He simply showed up quietly and consistently, and that was enough. And then one day something unexpected happened. The CEO was sitting in his study as usual when he heard a soft knock on the door. He looked up to see the maid standing in the doorway, her expression a little different from usual. She wasn't nervous or shy. Instead, she looked calm, confident even. I wanted to thank you," she said softly, her voice steady, "for everything, for being patient with me, for showing me that I don't have to be afraid anymore." The CEO smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You've done all the hard work," he said warmly. "I've just been here supporting you." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I think I'm ready to let go of the past, to start living again, and it's because of you." In that moment, the CEO realized something. He hadn't just helped her find the courage to open up. She had helped him too. She had shown him the value of patience, of listening, of truly being present for someone. She had reminded him that life wasn't just about business deals and power. It was about connection, about understanding, and about taking the time to truly see someone. He looked at her and nodded, his heart full. "I'm proud of you." And for the first time in a long time, the maid felt proud of herself too. She had come a long way, and though the journey wasn't over, she finally felt like she was ready to face the world. Not alone, but with someone who cared. The days that followed marked a quiet shift in the atmosphere of the mansion. The maid, who had once walked around with her head down and her thoughts locked away, began to change in subtle ways. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but those who spent time with her could notice the difference. She was no longer just the quiet figure who moved in the background, performing her duties. There was a new lightness in her steps, a new openness in her eyes. The CEO noticed it the most. He had spent so long observing her from a distance, trying to figure out what lay beneath the surface, and now that she was beginning to let down her guard, he found himself drawn to her more than ever. It was strange to him. He had never cared so deeply about someone who worked for him, but something about her, something in the way she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, had made him feel a connection he had never expected. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the mansion, the CEO found himself sitting in the living room, staring out the window. He was lost in thought when he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see the maid standing in the doorway holding a tray of tea. "Would you like some tea, sir?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a slight hesitance in her tone. For a moment, the CEO was caught off guard. It was rare for her to initiate anything like this, and he wasn't sure how to respond. But then he realized that this was a step forward, an indication that she was no longer hiding in the background, that she was finally starting to engage with him in a more personal way. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm. "Please, sit down." She hesitated, but then moved across the room to place the tray on the table. She sat down carefully, a few feet away from him, as though testing the waters, unsure of where the line between their roles should be drawn. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. The only sound, the soft clink of the teacups as she poured the steaming liquid. The CEO could sense the change in her, the subtle shift in her energy. It wasn't that she was no longer shy, but there was a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. She seemed more at peace with herself, as though she was beginning to accept that she didn't have to hide from the world, or from him. "How have you been?" the CEO asked, breaking the silence. He was genuinely curious, wanting to know how she was adjusting to the changes she had been making in her life. She paused before answering, taking a moment to consider her words. "I've been better," she said softly. "It's still a little hard, but I'm trying. I'm starting to trust again." The CEO felt a warmth spread through him at her words. It wasn't easy for her to admit that. He could see that she had been through a lot, that her journey to healing wasn't going to be a straight line. But the fact that she was trying, willing to trust again, spoke volumes about her strength. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "You've come a long way." She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I didn't think I could," she admitted, "but you made me believe it was possible." The CEO looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time in a way that felt different. He had always seen her as his employee, someone who was there to do a job. But now he saw something more. He saw a person who had been carrying a heavy burden, someone who had been afraid to trust, but was finding her way out of the darkness. And he realized that in some small way he had become part of that journey. "You're stronger than you know," he said gently. "It takes a lot of strength to open up, to let people in. It's not easy." Her eyes softened at his words, and for a moment she looked away, as though she were trying to process what he had said. She had always been the type to keep her emotions close to her chest, but now she was beginning to let them show. Slowly, piece by piece, she was revealing herself in ways she had never allowed before. "I never thought I'd be able to let anyone in," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always kept people at arm's length, but with you, it's different. I feel like I can be myself." The CEO's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and compassion. He had never expected to form such a connection with someone who worked for him, but there it was. It was a bond built on mutual understanding, on the quiet moments they had shared, and on the trust that was slowly developing between them. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he took a sip of his tea and let the silence settle between them. There was no need to rush. They didn't have to fill the space with words. It was enough for now, just to be in the same room, sharing this small, quiet moment. "I think I'm starting to understand what it means to trust someone," she said after a while, her voice more confident than it had been before. "And it's not just about the big things. It's about the small moments like this, like sitting here with you talking." The CEO smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "I'm glad you're feeling that way," he said softly. "You deserve to feel safe, to feel like you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." They continued to talk for a while longer, about small things, about their days, about the little moments that made life feel a little less heavy. There was no rush, no urgency. For the first time in a long while, the CEO felt like he was truly present in the moment, not thinking about business or the next meeting or the endless list of things that needed his attention. He was simply here with her, and that felt enough. As the evening wore on, the maid stood up to leave. But before she did, she turned to the CEO with a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice full of gratitude. "For everything. For being patient. For being here." The CEO looked up at her, his heart full. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. You've done the hard part. You've come this far and I'm proud of you." She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "I never thought I could be proud of myself," she admitted. "But now, I think I am." As she walked away, the CEO sat back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He had no idea where their journey would lead. But he knew one thing for certain. He had helped her take the first steps toward healing. And in doing so, he had also learned something about himself. For the first time in a long while, he realized that the world wasn't just about power and success. It was about the connections we make, the relationships we build, and the trust we allow ourselves to give. And in that moment, he knew that this was the beginning of something that neither of them had expected, something real. The quiet rhythm of the mansion had settled into a kind of comfortable normalcy. The days stretched on in a peaceful flow, and although there were still moments of hesitation between the CEO and the maid, they were learning to navigate the delicate balance between employer and employee, between distance and closeness. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For the CEO, the moments they shared together had become the most anticipated part of his day. He found himself looking forward to the brief interactions they had, the small conversations that seemed to reveal more of her every time. She was no longer just a maid in his eyes. She was someone he could talk to, someone who was starting to matter in a way he hadn't expected. He could see the way she was growing, the way she was shedding the layers of fear and doubt that had held her back for so long. And he couldn't help but admire her strength. One afternoon, the CEO found himself in the study, working on his usual paperwork, when he heard a soft knock on the door. He glanced up, expecting to see one of the staff, but instead it was the maid. She stood there, looking a little more hesitant than usual, her hands clasped in front of her. "Is everything all right?" the CEO asked, concerned by the expression on her face. She nodded quickly, but he could tell something was bothering her. There was a shift in her demeanor. She wasn't as calm and composed as she usually was. "I just wanted to talk," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I've been thinking about something and I'm not sure how to say it." The CEO gestured for her to sit, motioning to the chair across from his desk. "Take your time," he said, his tone warm and inviting. "I'm listening." She hesitated for a moment, then took the seat. She looked down at her hands as if gathering her thoughts before looking up at him. "I've been thinking about all the things I've been through, about everything that's happened in my life, and I realize I've never really let myself feel anything. I've always kept it all inside." The CEO remained silent, his gaze focused on her, allowing her the space to speak. He could see the internal struggle in her eyes, the same struggle that had been there from the very beginning, when she had first come into his life as a quiet, distant figure. Now she was opening up in ways that she had never done before, and he felt a deep sense of respect for her. "I don't know how to let go of all the fear," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to stop pushing people away. It's just how I've lived for so long. But lately, I've been wondering if I could change that, if I could stop being so afraid." The CEO leaned forward, his heart aching for her. He understood more than she knew. Fear wasn't something that could be easily overcome, especially when it had been ingrained in you for so long. But he also knew that change was possible, that with the right support, anyone could find the strength to break free from their past. "You don't have to do it all at once," he said softly. "Change takes time, and you don't have to be afraid of taking small steps. What matters is that you're willing to try." She nodded, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "I want to try," she said quietly. "I want to trust again." "But it's hard?" The CEO smiled gently, his eyes softening. "It is hard. But you don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you, and I'll be here every step of the way." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't looking at him with the same guarded expression. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, a willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice steady now, "but I want to start living it. I want to stop being afraid." "You will," the CEO said confidently. "You're already on the right path." And with that, the conversation ended. She stood up and left the room, but the CEO sat there feeling a quiet sense of pride in his chest. He knew that this wasn't a magic fix. She still had a long way to go, but she was starting to believe in herself. And that was the first step. The following days were filled with small, quiet victories. The maid began to trust the people around her more, allowing herself to be more open, more present. She started to join the CEO for brief conversations in the mornings, offering small insights into her life and her thoughts. She still wasn't ready to share everything, but it was a start. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, the CEO looked at her and smiled. "You're doing well," he said. "I can see the progress you've made." She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting a quiet sense of pride. "It's hard," she admitted. "But I'm trying." The CEO nodded. "And that's all that matters. Trying is the first step to change." They sat together for a while longer, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the garden. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple act of being present, of sharing the moment. It was a comfort that neither of them had realized they needed, and it felt like the beginning of something new. As the weeks passed, the maid's transformation became more evident. She was no longer the quiet, reserved figure she had once been. She still had moments of hesitation, but they were fewer now. She laughed more, smiled more, and even engaged in small conversations with the other staff members. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and she was finally beginning to feel the freedom that had been out of reach for so long.